Welcome to the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau with my partner, Tony Jokum. And welcome to Take 'em Down, Scattered Monuments and Queer Forgetting. So the Bureau is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And this is the service that we provide, is holding this space for queer books and queer culture of all kinds. So we're super happy to welcome Simon from Saarloos back to the Bureau after a few months hiatus, a couple of years, I guess, thanks to a little pandemic, which you might remember. So the Bureau is an all-volunteer independent organization, and we have a suggested donation of $10, but give what you can, pass a bag around with some change. And if you'd rather spend money on books, hold on to your money and buy some books, like this one. But let me pass this around. I also wanted to mention that if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that with me at the register. You'll get an email every other Monday about our upcoming events. And we do all kinds of events. So some are book related, but some are art related. Right now we have an exhibition called Satanic Panic by Catalina Schlieben-Munoz, which I love, which is really great. And afterwards, I'll take down the screen so you can see the full glory of Kata's Disney satanic work. It is, it's really great. We also have Satanic Panic t-shirts, so check it out. I'm going to hand it over to Simon, and we're going to jump right in and get started. So please give Simon a warm welcome.
I was going to try without the mic, but it might be better with, right? Yeah, okay, great. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you in this pink environment. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. We're going to be talking about Taken Down, Scattered Monuments and Queer Forgetting. And it's been a pleasure actually to been talking about this book for a little while. It came out in September 2019 in Dutch. It was called Herdenken Herdacht. And it was translated recently, it came out in May. And some things were added, some things were changed, but some shy people. But mostly it's been super fun to have been on a tour in Europe in May and June, and to be working with friends, collaborators, artists in every single stop, in every different city where we went, and mostly just to invite their work on questions of commemoration into the space and to really see the book as a kind of gathering space. Instead of approaching a book event as a kind of like, okay, this is what the book is about, etc. And sometimes that leads to a kind of scattered engagement with content. So let's see how that goes today. And that's also an invitation to you, like whenever you feel like you have questions, accusations, comments, please bring them in. And also feel that there's space afterwards. We're also hoping to go for drinks if you want to join. Housekeeping observations. There's a bathroom right outside, ungendered bathroom. And also I feel like I also always want to share before we start that there's this obvious hierarchy being constructed in the room where we're talking. On this side of the room, there's a microphone, so it's very official. There's this sort of vertical slot of gazes coming this way. The slot. But that being said, and you're sitting and we're half standing, or we're going to take those stools. Feel free to move about and be in your body as loud, quiet, jumpy, or not as you need to be. Stand up, leave, do whatever you need. So yeah, just be present how you feel present best, I would say. Today, I'm super excited to share yet another stage with two friends. Waqia is going to be sharing a video piece later on, a music piece. You might have heard some of Waqia's DJing already. I'm very happy that they're here. I'm gonna probably introduce you a little later. And then I'm super happy that I'll be in conversation with Megan Fernandes, or Meg. Yeah, we've also been friends for quite a few years now. And I'm just super happy that you, as a poet, among which Good Boys, and there's another one coming out, of which the title I'm trying, all the things, just tell
I do everything I'm told.
I do everything I'm
Super
told.
bottom energy.
Yeah. So join us for drinks. I do everything I'm told. Is coming out in the spring. So that's really exciting. But mostly I'm just super excited to be with you both here. And let's see where we take it. Do you want to come up?
Sure.
Meg? Yeah, I think that's what we do. We have one more. Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
It does feel like storytelling hour up here. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Meg.
I love this book. I read this book in one sitting, so that's also another reason to go buy the book. You can finish it. You can feel really good about yourself. Yeah. And the book begins in the Netherlands, obviously, where I spent a lot of time, although I learned that Simon actually was born in New Jersey. So that's also something we can talk about at drinks. But it begins with talking about monuments, right? And commemorative rituals, particularly Second World War monuments in the Netherlands and Western Europe in a larger context. And I was struck within the book by thinking about, can we imagine a commemorative ritual that isn't sort of based in a kind of atonement narrative, right? That is like trying to reproduce the nation. And I think the book is trying to disentangle like commemorative rituals with like nation state making. And that's kind of where the book opens, which is why I'm open with what feels like maybe sort of like a heavy question. But that's why I started with Jersey, so that I could get into this. So whatever you want to make of that, right? Like, what is the, can we have a commemoration without atonement? Is there something about national atonement that just actually can't really exist? Anything what you
Also, do you want some water?
No.
Okay. So I do want some water.
Okay.
But I can give
Would you
it.
like
Yeah,
me to
would you
get
like
you some water? Yeah. This is all being recorded.
You don't have to do that.
No.
Okay. Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the bottom end
Yeah.
is still there. Okay. Yeah, I think that question. Yeah, maybe in terms of like pedaling back into your question, bottoming even more than your question. So I don't know. I'm gonna drop the bottom because I'm gonna get stuck on that so hard. That's too much. Okay. For me, the book starts with a question, indeed, like you're saying and narrating. Thank you so much for reading. With the way in which commemoration is happening in the Netherlands, as you mentioned, around the Second World War, and how, and other people have written about this. Somebody like Claudia has, who's a scholar in the Netherlands and is known for example, a book like White Innocence. She writes about the way in which the Second World War consumes or subsumes or becomes a smokescreen for other histories that are shaping the material reality of the Netherlands in this current moment. So for example, the colonial history of the Netherlands is completely sort of subsumed by this constant commemoration of the Second World War, which does not come, I have to say, does not come from like a scarcity narrative. It's not like, oh, well, because we're doing this, we cannot do this, but it's a material question, right? Like, who is making the monuments? What are the monuments about? So in a way that already points to a kind of normative commemoration. And so the Second World War is functioning as a kind of a smokescreen, but it's also the way in which the Second World War immediately brings us to the activist agenda that is tied to commemoration. Because one of the ways in which the Second World War is approached is through this slogan of never again. Never again shall we have the fascism of the 40s. And by this never again, there's an evocation of, okay, this is what happened in the past. So we're already assuming things around time and what past events are, right? That are sort of closed. We can say that this, we can point to it and say this never again. And so we learn from the past and bring it into the future, or we make it a break into the future. That's why we commemorate. So there's already the sort of like active approach to commemoration. Well, then the question becomes, okay, we're commemorating from the hope or idea or prospects to not reproduce fascism into the future. But then when looking at the ways in which we commemorate or through which we commemorate, they're very traditional. Like you were saying, the nation state, right? They're upholding certain structures that are tied to the nation states, that are tied to collectivity, to mass and collective understandings of justice. And also like on an almost epistemological level, so like on the level of like, how do we think we are able to identify an event and say that this is an event and this is something that we should commemorate or focus on the level of time. So the ability to point to certain dates and say this is when it began and this is when it ended.
Sorry, I wanted to make sure the live stream's working. It's working.
Perfect. Yeah. Disruptions are welcome. And that's for real. So yeah, thinking about time, right? The focus on dates, but also the idea that there's a collective understanding of when we commemorate. So for example, in the Netherlands on May 4th, there's 2 minutes of silence. And the 2 minutes of silence are a very important commemorative moment. And those are based on like a contract. So there's an agreement that we are now entering into silence. So that is just all to say, I'm sorry, I don't like to wait enough to get there, but like it's such a short book, so I don't know why. But like it's easier to read it than to sit here. But these are all like agreements on which they're based, and they're all agreements around how we produce knowledge or how we produce understanding. And so the question then becomes like, how do you commemorate anti-fascism from the prospect of not wanting to reproduce fascism through potentially the structures of knowledge that produce daily fascism still. So it becomes that kind of question. And then that's for me where it starts. And then your question about like whether I believe that is possible.
Maybe I can sort of clarify, which is to say there's a part in the book which I think you're going to read. And this book is sort of littered with imagery of toppled statues, of ruins, of an argument for like dismemberment in a way. And you were telling me that the translation of the word from Dutch has this kind of play on active remembrance and not thinking about memory as something that is like nostalgic, static, reflective, passive, that actually is constantly interpolating. So it has like the temporality of like a rupture, right? So I was just thinking when I was like asking this question about atonement, which is like, is there a way to have something commemorative that's not asking for forgiveness for being forgiven, you know? And you have these ruins kind of, I don't know if you're using sort of that language, but there's sort of like that kind of imagery that pervades the book, which is to say, like, do we need to be asked to be forgiven for not being cohesive, for not actually wanting to be subjects, for like actually being like, I think you were making an argument that you were like asking people to like tear down statues, but to leave the statues there broken in the streets, and that should be not the disappearance of them, but sort of like they're kind of coming apart. And then there's a great part of the book where I think you talk about a camera that is put to protect some like colonial seafarer statue. And that you were like, God, is there anything more pathetic than this? Having this empty camera eye looking after this statue, monitored by some police, like how much protection can this inertness have?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, maybe that's it, like, do we need to find atonement for that? That's kind of a complicated question, and you can either answer that, or you can read from the part of the book that I think speaks to that, whatever you like, obviously, because it's your own author.
I'm gonna ask a real basic language question, but
Yeah.
what would you describe with atonement mean for you?
Thank you for that question. I'm thinking about this in terms, actually I was thinking about I think it's the Sarah Ahmed piece, where she's talking about the relationship between shame and pride. And so the way that monuments that are trying to atone for shameful acts by the nation actually become this sort of like way of like being nationalist and like having a national affect and become like patriotic in the worst sense of the term, right? And then I'm also thinking about like a friend of mine, Kevin Young, who's director of the African American Museum in DC, who said something like, Meg, you have no idea how many times like people come to these spaces, not just to like, not to like look at this material in a way that is like honoring, but to look in this, to come and like take photos with it, like white supremacists come, you know what I mean? And like take photos with like the objects or the personal like belongings of like Trayvon Martin the museum has like acquired. So like these like things become part of also, it works both ways, you know, this kind of voyeurism for trauma subject. And I think that that's what I was thinking about, like this kind of like really cynical side of part of atonement that is actually linked to white supremacy and fascism. And like, you know, whiteness also needs to be forgiven so much, like constantly, you know, and there's something really deep politicizing about that too. So I don't know where the question is there, but maybe it's just something to think about. We can talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much there, and I think like my mind jumps in different places, scattered as always. But there's the question of order that's there, right? And I think like there's in memory studies a whole debate between whether commemoration needs to offer order and therefore kind of comfort in a disordered world, so to say. And I'm sort of more leaning towards not. It should not, because it should not be order, nor should it be called disorder, because I don't think that we are at a point where you can name what disorder within disorder could actually mean, if that's not too abstract. So there's one way to think about this very concretely is to think about commemoration with and from the voices that speak disorder instead of that which appeases disorder. But that almost already leans towards like a representational form of commemoration, right? And through the concept of abundance, which is in the beginning of the book, I try to think against this kind of representational commemoration where it's like, oh, what if we just, when I say I, by the way, this is not me. This is me having written this little book, but like in constant conversation and collaboration with all the people that I cite and do not cite, right? But let's say I, in this case, I try to think about how
We wanted to come in.
it's a good disruption. Yeah, I'm trying to think, what was I going to say? With abundance, how representational commemoration does not work instead of like adding voices, because then we have the same question happening when referring to sort of like this fascist form of commemoration, right? Which is that you just add seats to the table. I mean, this conversation is known, I'm sure, to many people here. So what would it mean, and this is what I'm hearing also in your question, like not to disorder who is speaking or who is embodying. Okay, I thought I was gonna drop it, but Freud just slips his way always. How are you embodying? Embodying.
The title of the next book. I'm just saying people can come in and make.
You're so great. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi, hello. yeah, how are you embodying? The question of order would be how are you embodying these different disordering stories, and you would add those. But I think that your question also asks like, what would it mean to think about disorder, not as a new structure, but as a way of staying away from a structure, but it might just be going off too much. Like I'm thinking about like how, I'm thinking about maybe the rubble, right? So like, I'm sort of proposing, no, okay, don't clean them up. And this is of course a reference to take them down. And also to refer to the part that you mentioned in Rotterdam, the camera on the statue is, the camera was added after this summer. Last summer, I should say, last summer, when people were throwing paint at the statue and trying to take it down. And instead, of course, of like taking this question up and like going into conversation about what was happening with the statue, they put down this camera, or they put up this camera. And but thinking with the taken down movement, thinking about the statues falling and leaving the rubble, I think leads to your question, but I'm still circling so much about it, so maybe I should just stop talking. But I do want to think with your question. And one of the ways is to say like, okay, let the rubble lay down, right? Like let the pieces of the statue be, instead of cleaning it up, or instead of having a counter monument, which is a lot of what's happening now on material level. Commemorative movements are like all about counter monuments, like either adding a flag or adding a statue or dressing the statue up. And these are all valid engagements. I'm not trying to say anything against that. But like what would happen if you would leave the rubble on the street? You get a question of inaccessibility. And I think that's where I kind of want to dwell with commemoration, is not to be like, okay, what do we need to heal, for example, which is also where your question of atonement leads to, right? If we think about healing, we're again skipping ahead, wanting to forgive something, wanting to deal with something. And there's a we implied. There's an implied we about like, as if we know which we that is, as if we know which public space we're talking about. And for me, the rubble, and maybe I should just read it, but like the rubble that's down there questions also the sort of patterns through which we understand people to move and to which we expect them to move. And instead of saying there's better ways, the rubble would obstruct. And maybe this space of obstruction is where we can dwell. And the other thing that your question makes me think of, and I'll just give you the mic and see what happens, but like, the other question that it makes me think of is of function. So again, like this is why I began with never again, the sort of slogan that circles around the Second World War, which is this idea that commemoration always needs to have a kind of function, right? So there is something that we get from commemoration. And there's discussions about what it is that we get, and this is where your forgiveness question comes in, or the healing question comes in, or grief, just sitting with the grief, right? Which is also where, when we mentioned before disorder, staying with disorder or bringing in some order and moving maybe to some feeling of redemption or catharsis. But there is an immediate linearity in the desire for commemoration to function towards anything. And I don't know what it looks like to say like, okay, we don't move towards anything at all. But what if commemoration does not have a function?
I think I'm hearing like something about an argument for like disruption. And there was this moment in the book where Simon writes about the 2 minutes of silence. And you also have this way of saying like, I wish there was a way it was 2 minutes to actually be loud. Like why, you know, what is silence? Like, it's a formal construct, 2 minutes, no talking. And I think this is also getting to what you're saying about like representational, like aesthetics of commemoration. And I do want to hear this part where you read directly from the book, but I also think in terms of just getting to an argument about disruption, and also commemoration as constantly having to, it comes from remembering actively, but also remembering where we are dismembered. And of course, disability studies is a big part of the methodology of thinking through some of the arguments you're making in the book. And we talked about on this beautiful morning walk the other day with coffee, and it's definitely not hungover, and it was really clear-headed. And you said something about, you know, a time in your life, which is in the book, where you did not have, I think you were in a wheelchair for a short period, right? And getting to the edge of a curve where there was no slope, and having to actively remember like that, the rupture, you know, the way that time feels so ruptured, like actively remember, oh right, like this is the body I'm in right now. And I don't know if maybe you can talk a little bit about like disruption or like that concept of memory that you're sort of like, and forgetfulness. Like the book is about queer forgetting. It's like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think, and then we could show maybe some of the film that Claudia sent us. I'll introduce that in a second. Yeah, I think so. What I was referring to is like using a wheelchair and using the pavement in public space, and then encountering a moment in pavement where there's no slope or ramp, and so therefore being unable to cross the street. And I think a lot of the times when we're thinking about commemoration, right, there's like I was saying before, there's such a push to think about like counter monuments or like what should be commemorated. And I have been finding some interest in calling these moments, like these moments of physical presence in space where there's a disjuncture between you and the architecture that supposedly is there to smoothen your way. To call those moments of commemoration. So the moment of encountering a pavement without a slope and not being able to cross the street would be a moment to say, okay, that's a commemorative moment. Because in that moment, I'm being confronted, not necessarily with my own body, I'm being confronted with the history of my embodiment. The way in which my body has not been taken in account, or the embodiment, I don't dare to say that word anymore because of the bombing, but the body that is in that is not being taken into account. So there is a commemorative practice there. And I think this is where I'm moving to the embodied commemoration in the book, where it's not so much like, and this refers to your question about nationalism, right? Where it's not so much about constructing new forms of commemoration, but about using commemoration to recognize the constant moments of already happening disruption in daily life. And does it give, like, this is a question, right? Like, does it give an authority to that experience by calling it commemoration? Does it matter? Do you need that kind of authority, right, at the same time? The queer forgetting relates to that in some way. I'll spell it out here a little bit. I also feel like I should shout out to Jack Halberstam, who's here, who I'm citing in the book around queer forgetting. I'll say it in my words. The queer forgetting, I start with that partly in a disability experience, like having to forget an embodiment of walking around, etc., when using a wheelchair in order to live in the current presence. So like that's an active form of forgetting by saying like, okay, I know that I cannot have my previous embodiment, so I'm just gonna launch into this one right now. And then of course that changed again. So there's a moment in which forgetting leads to a kind of engagement with the present. That's like how I started introducing it. And then going into queer forgetting on a more theoretical level is saying, for example, it's about the lineage, right? The heterosexual lineage and the reproduction that runs through that lineage. So if I say that my dad had it, his dad had it, his dad had it, my son will have it, and his son will have it, you see that there's a passing on happening. So there's an accumulation or a passing on through time. And this can also be related to capitalism very much, right? That's accumulation of an inheritance that's going to continue. There's the expectation of continuation there. There's the linearity. So there's all of these different, I would say, intersections that it works with. And queer forgetting is not, I would say, an actual forgetting necessarily, whatever that may mean, right? But a moment of recognizing that a lineage needs to be broken and therefore not sustaining the lineage. So with the queer forgetting, this often happens in the sense of like, you're not doing what your parents want you to do. That's a form of forgetting. Forgetting the lessons that you have gotten, right? And implementing those. Yeah, and then there's some examples in the book. I'm trying to think of some.
Yeah, I think there was something in the book that was sort of like, this is also a kind of like anti-romance of origins, right? And describes, saying many scholars, that straight time is theorized as the repetition of habits and this perpetuation of habits into a kind of indefinite chronological time. And that, queer forgetting comes from this idea or space of rupture, right? And I think you also quoted Celia Hartman in this part of the book where you said something like, like if you don't have access to a origin or an archive, right? As a good post-colonial scholar might say, right, there is no such thing as an archive, right? If you don't have access to this sort of chronological way of thinking about like history, right, then what does it mean to remember things that can be fabulous and that can, do you know what I mean, or sort of building more through like an imaginative way of understanding however you want to come to the present, rather than something through generations, right? Generations, and also like pinpointing which generations like matter, which decades matter, or which wars matter, right? And which figureheads matter, right? That rupture is a way of kind of sort of destabilizing those stasis, right? Of those figures and time periods, right? Can I ask if you might read from this section,
Sure.
and then we can introduce it all.
Yeah, fantastic.
Sure.
Just gonna stand to the middle.
Because I'm not in the background on this live stream.
This is again an invitation for you to go around or do whatever feels good to your body.
Or shout accusations.
Or
as we
shout
said, yeah.
accusations as a bottom. Don't mind. Okay, I told I was going to stop, but I'm not able to really forget. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, I'm just gonna read a little bit from what you've probably already heard just now. I wish the broken fragments of toppled statues could be left scattered on the sidewalk, blocking the way, necessitating a detour or causing people to stumble. A fallen statue, at least in my memory of media events, signifies revolution, a political reversal, or a form of symbolic retribution. This makes a deposed statue a symbol of spectacular change. But is it also possible to live with toppled statues, to experience history as a daily source of irritation, to live with the rubble? German artist Günter Stemnig developed the Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, which he placed in front of houses from which Jewish people had been deported. They stick up slightly, disturbing the flat rhythm of the pavement. A Stolperstein works only in an environment where everything has been arranged in an orderly manner, since it needs to stand out. In New Orleans or Istanbul, which are contexts that I talked about earlier in the book, a Stolperstein would not be noticed, since the pavements are not smooth and the roads are full of potholes. They are stumbling cities, places where commemoration is part of everyday life because the lack of care for public space literally creates holes that make people aware of what isn't there. Disturbance and disruption are dependent on a smooth, well-tended environment. After all, for the course of events to be interrupted, there has to be an obvious course of events in the first place, a schedule. If that fixed regular course of events isn't there, or let's say if it's not measurable and clear, then in the Netherlands, at least we talk of quote unquote disadvantaged neighborhoods or chaos. Without wanting to romanticize a lack of care, I wonder whether institutionalized commemoration happens mainly at places where everything is so well ordered and efficient that there's barely any space for daily embodied commemoration. The Stolperstein brings me back to ableism. Ableism doesn't happen only at obvious times with someone consciously saying something denigratory about disabled people. Our societies are ableist in their construction, since many places are inaccessible to people with disabilities. Some have special means of entry, but these involve extras and additionals, a ramp at the doorstep, or a service booked in advance. There's nothing wrong with such aids, but a radically anti-ableist perspective goes further than assimilation by analyzing how crudely our current world building centralizes certain bodies. How the mobility of certain people, whom we tend to call healthy or normal, is always the norm in the design of public space. Thinking from the point of view of disability, from life in an ableist society, from crypt knowledge, causes us to think differently about commemoration. Monuments might slow people down. Monuments might be something for people to stumble over, preferably those people for whom the world is arranged so that they can move around freely. Their ease of movement is a great inconvenience to those classified as disabled, for whom the world has not been organized. I do not at all mean to say that the people for whom society has been designed never stumble. Every life involves pain and opposition. This is not about individualized experience, but about the material structures that define exclusion. I'm thinking of the curbs across the pavement area, the steps in front of the door, the elevator that's broken, the high or underground platform, or schools that are organized around one specific concept of intelligence and neural arrangement. As Noemi Lombard describes it in the magazine, The Funambulist, and this is a quote: "These streets, these cafes, these nightclubs, these shops, these theaters, these restaurants, all reinforce his social standard. Disabled people are supposed to stay inside, while able people can go wherever they like. The city is made without me in mind, and because of this, the environment disables me more than my body does." End quote. Lombard does not want to be invited to join in with the things that are currently deemed normal. She asks, what would the city look like if my body were to be taken as the norm? Or rather as one of the many norms. The Stolperstein is placed in an organized and orderly environment, deployed as an interruption to the ordinary and the everyday. How do you show respects during a silent commemoration of victims of the Second World War, the commemoration that Meg was mentioning, if you have a noisy body, or a body that spasms and cannot sit still? What does it mean to commemorate from intimacy with disruption rather than welcoming disruption as a temporary presence? That's the part.
You want to introduce the poem?
Yes.
I'll let you do that.
Yeah.
I'll sit back down.
But I'm also going to call grab up too. I guess when I was reading that, I was thinking I wanted to shout out also Kenneth Gosling, who's here, from whom I learned a lot about disability organizing. And thank you for that. And that's also why we wanted to bring in a suggestion by Claudia Rankine, who's been super supportive in the process of publishing this book, where Claudia Rankine, I cite her also in the book, how she's approaching the weathering of the Black body and what it means to live in a society where you're constantly told to forget the sort of microaggressions and experiences that you're going through every day, and you're sort of told to forget them in order to keep living within them, right? In a way to postpone and to constantly postpone refusal. And so one of the, and she's not here, she's not in New York right now. And so one of the ways that we wanted to bring her in anyway and sort of like constantly remember also the ways in which a book comes together with so many different voices. She brought in a video that was made by a now, I think, grad student, but then somebody who made a short film, I think it's 1 minute, for her high school project. It's called Race to the Bus. And I think it shows in many ways what we have been talking about in relationship to the pavement, for example.
Of course, it gets complicated. There we go.
There's no sound, which is it's a silent film. Yeah.
Whoops, that is not what I want to do. I want to go back to Zoom.
Yeah.
And share screen. I don't know why. I don't understand why it's doing this. Of course, it works perfectly beforehand. Why is this not showing up? I mean, it's showing up here. I'm just trying to share screen.
It might be because you're on full screen with the video.
Oh, thank you. There we go.
Great, one quick thing, sorry, I'm trying to help. Can you unshare, because you didn't share the audio, so the folks on Zoom won't be able to hear.
There's no sound.
Oh, that's actually.
Nope, it's real. Okay.
Maybe I'll ask why you, oh, that's a little, maybe a little, I'm looking at myself on the screen. Maybe I'll ask why you decided to share this film, how you feel like it intersects with what we've been talking about. I mean, I have thoughts in my head. This is the first time I've seen the film. This seems very in line, obviously, with Claudia's interests and Uvra about infrastructure and also I think the like not being able to see the driver too. I think that there's sort of this kind of anonymity of the infrastructure, but I'm kind of interested in sort of why you chose this.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you said, and then here the question of like, what does it do when we call these embodied daily experiences commemorative moments, right? Instead of looking at commemoration through this lens of like having national monuments, having institutionalized monuments, what would it do anything for an activist agenda? And here I'm of course countering myself when I said like maybe commemoration shouldn't function for anything. But what would it do if these moments were recognized? Are they already recognized, right? This is another thing. I'm not trying to in any way say that they're not recognized by people who are in this moment experiencing. So I think for me, there's a weight around like, what can we do with thinking about commemoration to counter structures of injustice? So that's where the video hints to. I think also the citation that I bring in from Claudia Rankine is about how the body is a vessel of memory. So both being in some ways a guide to move forward, because we know certain things, we act certain ways, and at the same time it being a weight. So here the forgetting comes in as well, right? Like, is it possible to forget certain things in order to approach with a kind of spontaneity or openness, right? Which also leads to a kind of white approach to the world in the sense of like, oh, you don't have to be so heavy. Why are you expecting that this, why do you think this is about race? Why don't you just think that the bus just drove off, right? And so Claudia Rankine's work really engages with this question of like, okay, how do you deal with that being both potentially true, but also naming racism and not just naming it, which is annoying, right? Like not just letting it be a title, but the embodied experience to think from.
I was struck when you read your excerpt with the word irritation. And I think also there's something about the bus where you see just like the face falling, right? Of person gonna stop. And like, I'm also thinking about like that language of irritation or daily inconvenience, you know, also kind of mentioning the slope, the curve, where it's like the dailiness is almost like the anti-ritual or the anti-commemoration. It's like, it's not an event that happens that has this like neat opening and ending, but it's this kind of like what it means to have ongoing remembering and also forgetting of those inconveniences or irritations that otherwise they feel so much. I'm wondering if this may be a good moment to like see if anybody has any questions. And I hope I can just be really open and say that on the walk, Simon did say something like, I'm a little nervous about doing an event in New York. And I was like, yeah, I get that. Like, there's so many assholes here. And I know there are no assholes in the room. Because I will speak to you afterwards. And by that, I think also we were kind of like talking about like who is in the room often at these events. And like how I feel like you really wrote this book with a lot of like, you know, scholarly and academic, right? Like language and theorists, and but like wanting, the book is like, it feels like the audience is meant to be really expansive, and that like, you know, who the book is for and who the book is speaking to is almost like antithetical to sort of the language of criticality. That sometimes it feels like in certain kind of rooms, like the opening is like, you know, when you were like accusations, I was like, yeah, okay, accusation, interrogation, but like academia is so boring with the language of its interventions. So like, I challenge you, if you have a question, like, yeah, can the question come from a place like that maybe slightly more poetic, at least poetic, critical, rather than like, you know, intervention, you know, because that can feel really violent and it's really nice and calm up here, like in a spa. So, yeah, any questions? Any thoughts? Go ahead, and maybe you could say
So maybe you can repeat the question?
Yeah,
sure. Well, I'm gonna
Thank you. So many notes that I've been taking. My question is about disability in the mind and commemoration. Like, did you use the word, Simon, neuro arrangement in the And like thinking about like what crazy or mad or neurodivergent commemoration would be, or like brain fog commemoration, where you're like, what was the name? When did that, what year? You know, you can't actually precisely arrange. Yeah, and also I was like, Ronnie and I were talking, I was like looking at all these books being like, oh my God, so much reading to do. There's so much study obligation, and like reading and studying as like the form of good commemoration. And it feels like there's something queer about being like, I'm also really interested in the category of like bimbo activism, where you're just kind of like, what was that again? Like, what did that and like the kind of fun intervention that can actually be that counters this like this gravitas of like very like neurotypical commemoration. So I'm wondering if like how that might show up for you, or how you might be thinking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I can fully repeat that. What was that again?
Exactly.
So the bimbo activism of what is that again, but also the question of disability and the mind. And so, for example, what does brain fog do? What does brain fog do to commemoration? And for example, like when you said that, I really felt how stuck I've been on the botany, right? Like from the moment that you said that, which it feels like something that I'm like, this is not at all helping and functional in this moment, but I just cannot get it out of this mind loop. So that's saying that, right? Like feels to me in some ways that it counters the idea of having a good linear argument. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, brain fog is, to me, again, that leads to this. I'm curious what you would say also in relationship to poetry and the way in which poetry allows for kind of gaps that the academic speech that you were referring to often doesn't allow for, or is very good at masking the gaps, right? One of the sort of questions that I've been thinking about is categorization, right? The way in which we cling to categorization as a form of respect. So not just silence, right? Having 2 minutes of silence, that's respectful, but also categorizing, bringing the bodies back. Bringing the bodies back, by which I mean knowing where, and this also comes to the origin, right? Knowing where people are from, knowing where they are, knowing which victims belong to which event, so to say. And I talk about it in relationships, in relationship also to a plane crash, which involved, which was MH17. It was Russian ground, and the plane was shot down, and it involved a lot of Dutch citizens who were in that plane, mostly because they were on their way to a congress or conference in Australia about HIV. And so I'm just looking at it because of disability and also because of queer punishment, that the narratives that then came up in response. But a lot of the questions for me were in that moment where about, okay, we have to have the names, we need to know what I'm sorry to say gruesomely, we need to know what well, let me not say gruesomely, you can fantasize it yourself, but like what belongs to which people, and really like bringing everything together. For me, the question in that, relating to your question, Kevin, is why is that that categorization so comforting? If it's actually through categorization that we suffer so much and that we reproduce so many injustices, why then is it called respectful to be able to say these victims belong to this? And also, of course, the calculus of it, the amount of people. We also always need to know the amount of people involved, the amount of people affected. And there's been critiques of this in journalism, but I think the critique of it is much larger than just a journalism critique of like, oh, we only care about it if it's this close and with enough deaths, so to say. No, I think that the problem is more about how do we think we know that this is valuable at all or not at all, and that we reproduce that in commemorative practices that use categorization as a form of respect, actually.
Yeah, I think what I heard in your question was also something about like the limits of what someone can know, which I think is also in the book, that knowledge actually doesn't really get us anywhere, and like what to, you know what I mean? Like, what can we know? And also, is there something kind of like radical about just being like, yeah, I don't know, and like, but like, you know, leaning into what people, you know, like the performance of naivete and being an amateur. I think obviously that's like super gendered, but I also think about like what gets to count as, you know, like authority in certain situations. And I remember seeing a talk like Fred Moten had given, where, you know, he talks about his mother, and he's like, you know, my mother wasn't, you know, like what people might call like a political activist, but she could get people into a room. And, you know, getting people into a room, like if you can throw a party and people show up, you know, people trust you. That is like a form of like authority. That is a kind of knowledge, you know. By the way, I throw a great party, somebody shows up. But like truly, like, so what does it mean to also like not have like this like extensive, unknowable amount of knowledge, not want to like be able to perform it, like, you know, personally, like you're saying poetry, like I come from a very complicated like diaspora, like my parents are like third generation East African, Portuguese colonized Indians, you know, who grew up under like British occupation. And sometimes when I have to explain it to people, I feel like what I'm doing is like reciting a Wikipedia entry that doesn't even exist. Do you know what I mean? And it feels so inauthentic because it's quite rootless. And what can I actually know? You know, and what can I actually know in a way that like makes me not sound like I'm exoticizing something? So I think there's this also like, you know, and I've been writing a lot about that in this like verse novel form. And it's really like, interestingly, there's just a lot of time travel. It's a lot of like time travel back to people who can't understand you and be like, so there's this show, it's about drag queen, stick with me. And like, you know, that kind of rupture of time and geography. And in poetry, like there's so many long poems, like Claudia's like, you know, famous for this, like the Tommy Pico's nature poem, Gwendolyn Brooks in the Mecca, where these sort of long form epics, but like not a traditional epic. People just like go back in time and fail to explain themselves and fail to have their presence explained. And that's like, I think, really kind of important, because that is the limit of knowledge. We're not actually legible, you know. Somebody else had a question. Yeah, that's right.
I just love to respond one more thing to it, because of what you were saying, that it made me think about like how mostly I'm interested in like how certain things serve certain people or certain agendas, right? So repetition, this is why I mentioned the bottom again, and not just as a confessional, like, oh, you know, I might get stuck on things, and then, but because if you're trying to make an argument and you keep repeating the same thing that doesn't make any sense in the room, or that's not important, or it's emotional, most of the time that's not going to serve you. The repetition is not serving you. But when it's a national commemoration or an institutional commemoration, repetition serves authority. So I'm also like, and this is also what Claudia Rankine points to, right, is that repetition leads to suspicion, because experiencing repeated racism is not because you can point it out and say like, oh, it's repeated and every day it's going on, and you continue to point it out. It doesn't mean that people are going to take you more serious. Where if it's like a monumental form of repetition, then suddenly the repetition serves credibility. So that's also something nice.
Okay, yes.
I'm not somebody in academia, and you used a term that it seems so perfectly contradictory to the point, memory studies. Like that is so incredibly contradictory and makes no sense. Like I'm always so curious about how academia is always sort of slithery and slippery with itself. What does that mean? What are you talking about?
I love that slithery.
But then as a second to follow up that, I think one of the things that I'm thinking about so much listening to this. I haven't read the book yet. Is like in the US, Civil War monuments went up well after the Civil War as a reassertion of white power, like after Reconstruction and with Jim Crow. So like the timing of the commemoration was also an intentional reintroduction of a fascist state, right? That was a white supremacist fascist state. And then I'm thinking about that, and then you start talking about queerness, and I'm like, well, queerness is so slippery because we assume disruption as a commonality among queer people. We assume a disruption with heterosexuality as a common experience. I don't think it's the only one, but I think it's an organizing principle, I think, in queerness. And I think I'm like, the like kid I know who's the parent of queer parents, or the kid of queer parents who disrupted homosexuality to be straight. Like the ways in which in some version of the world there's people who are queer but don't disrupt, or disrupt in ways that are unruly too. I don't know what I'm saying, but it's just like a lot of thoughts that I'd be interested in. I don't know how you think about how we commemorate queerness is ultimately what I'm pointing at. Why we commemorate Stonewall when we do, why we commemorate the AIDS crisis, the ongoing AIDS crisis when we do.
That's a great question.
No.
Do you really want to know more about memory studies, or should we do that?
Can you just define it? It's ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous, but also intriguing. Like,
Yeah, well, the quick version that I know a little bit of is, or know nothing of, I mean, what are you talking about? Would be around like how the field of memory studies came up, especially in the 90s, in the sort of recognition that the Second World War was not going to have any more living survivors. So how are we going to cultivate commemoration? So it's actually the way that I have learned about memory studies is very much through the Second World War, and that the field actually responds to that very much, and to the idea of living survivors. And it's quite caught up with questions of preservation. I think there's also like interesting intersections maybe with a sort of naturalized or essentialist discourse around commemoration and memory. So memory not just as the mind and disability, but memory literally as like, what can the mind hold? And there, I don't know if I should go into that, but like there's a lot of scarcity narrative around that, right? Where it's like, okay, you can only remember so much if you're studying for an exam. You build a house. I don't know if you know this trick, but you build a house, and in the house you put certain words or you put certain concepts, and then you walk through the house and you will find the concepts, and then you can remember it during your exam. So there's a way in which like this sort of like, oh, we should like memorize as a practice. That's quite capitalist, right? Also like a functional memory relates very much to the scarcity narrative that I'm addressing in the book. Like, what would it mean if we think that it's possible to commemorate everything all at the same time? But without thinking that you as a person, so the subjectivity that you kind of hinted to in your first question, the subjectivity that can hold is not present within that, because it's not about one person or one individual being able to commemorate or memorize or remember everything all at the same time. And this is where the abundance kind of comes in, where it's like you can somehow materially acknowledge that everything is present everywhere, and that there's so much present that you cannot have access to, or even deem possible, or even understand the senses through which you would be able to have some form of access. But you can still acknowledge that abundance existing in some ways without claiming access, which also comes in right with this question of like, okay, you don't need to know in order to respect, which brings us back to Quentin's question about categorization. And then in regards to queerness, yeah, I take up a lot in the book around like homo nationalism and like the way in which like I don't want to throw out words, but the way in which queerness is nothing radical in and of itself at all. But maybe in relationship to time, I'm interested in queerness in relationship to time, which also came up when we talked a little bit about Jack's work around queer forgetting and also adding the queer time, right? The way in which linear progressive time can be disrupted by queerness, whatever that may mean. And it also brought me back to what you said, also brought me back to the way in which queer, like commemorating the histories of queer people can be in some sense an inspiration by when thinking about commemoration, because of the ways in which we sometimes are written out of history and there's nothing to find, right? There's all of this talk about like the non-chronological, or like how it's violent, right? Like in some ways to out people if they haven't out themselves, which is a very, very much a focused question on representation. But like the actual question of like, what can we read into something that is not archived is more interesting to me then, right? Like, so like, if we suspect queerness everywhere all the time, what kind of reading tools or what kind of ways of engagement with the archives that do not document that queerness do we come up with or do we engage with without producing queer stories or essential queer stories, or by having to say even like, oh, they were gay. Okay. You know, like, so
I think you did great with those questions. But I was thinking that, like, you know, memory studies, I don't know what that means in terms of academia, but like, I think that there's part of the book where you talk about, you know, forgetting is not repression. And I think that, you know, the way that that language of repression and forgetfulness, and I think you said like cognitive dissonance, right? That this is all a kind of, it's all a sort of paradigmatic. There's something, you know, not quite synonymous there, but they're definitely in orbit with each other, this kind of language around forgetting. A fun story is that I tried hypnotherapy. So you said mind palaces, so I was thinking about memory studies, and I was like, this guy's like, you know, I shouldn't be. This is not the guy. This is super evangelical. He's always like, Daniel, and we have classes, and like, I'm just like, I should do this. But in terms of like memory studies and thinking about like the constellation of like repression and like memory and invention, right, and imagination, I think like the idea is like, you know, memory is deeply, of course, imaginative. It's like fabulous, it's playful, it's non-signifying, honestly. And nobody wants to say that because they want it to be truth. But actually, like, there's nothing less truthful than memory. And I think that there, you know, and my hypnotherapy session taught me that. I don't recommend it. I think we had a question back. I just want to be mindful of time. Was there a question? No? I did.
Hi, I can't wait to read your book. Thank you for this rich theoretical framework. I came to this space with a little bit of a different understanding of never again, the phrase. I was wondering if you could just reflect on how hearing it in different languages you experience or hold in your mind makes you feel, because you know, it's been a very enlightening conversation, but it's also very theoretical, and the book is very beautiful. And yeah, I'm just wondering about your feelings that come up for you when you hear that phrase, and maybe some of the normative structures that it might call to mind and body for you.
yeah, could you share about how you have encountered never again, like how it feels for you?
Sure. I think that for me it was just slightly different, but maybe importantly, didn't refer to exactly the war between nation states, like fascist Germany versus the Allied powers, which included the totalitarian Soviet Union. It referred specifically to the genocide of handicapped people, migrant people, Jewish people, which was outside of the war between nation states, and that those nation states were actually all complicit. The State Department in the United States knew European countries were complicit. Soviet Union carried out its own genocide. So it is quite a different orientation in some ways.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, could be problematic in the different discourses. So I was just wondering how you, felt about it when you heard it. It's very loaded. It's a very loaded phrase, you know?
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's so interesting to me that you're saying it's a loaded phrase, because to me, then the question comes out, where did the loadedness come from? And since we were talking about repetition before, I think partly the loadedness comes from the repetition. And so why, which is not to say that there's not a loadedness to the amount of people affected. I'm not trying to in any way deny that. I just think that for me, like affectively, I wonder from who is the phrase, right? Of who speaks the phrase, and the fact that it's a common, collectively phrased phrase makes me feel proximate to the institutionalization of that desire. So the desire being not to have genocide of the people you just mentioned.
Right.
However, living in the Netherlands, living in a country that's a colonizer country that has not reconciled, I don't think it's possible to reconcile with it in any way. I'm not trying to say that it should be reconciled with, because that's jumping ahead again. But that does not even dwell with its own colonial relationships that are ongoing, right? That are happening every single day. The never again, somehow, for me effectively, but then I'm gonna speak because you asked me about my feelings, right? Points to the desire of a state to lead towards a kind of innocence, where it's able to protect its citizens. So it brings me to the question of protection, the idea that the state can protect citizens, which I do not believe. So I think there's a promise that's being spoken there that is upholding the state. That would be my response, which is not the same as saying like that we do not wish that genocide never happens again, but obviously it's been happening. So that it's not that there's an actuality there. I don't think it's a statement of actuality. I think it's a statement of promise that refers also to a kind of linear future that needs to be protected, and the state is invested in protecting a linear future of betterment that I don't actually think exists. But yeah, does that make sense? Yeah.
I would just say that reading your, book, and I think you said something like that. I think it says something like "never again" as like a campaign as it's been sort of enacted will not prevent fascism, and hasn't. Like it's not great over there right now. So I think that there is something also about what does commemoration mean as a preventative action? I don't know if that's possible. Yeah, but you asked about feelings because Dan's a poet like me. We love feelings.
Yeah, maybe one more thing I'll say, then I would love to introduce Waqia, but you mentioned the moment that, so during those 2 minutes silence that are every year, etc., and we know when they come, and there's a trumpet that plays, and then we start, and the trams in the city of Amsterdam stop, and everywhere around the country, etc. There's a 2 minutes of silence. One in 2013, I believe, there was somebody who screamed really loud during those 2 minutes, and everybody's dispersed. The Queen, because, well, was it the Queen, or I think now it's the Queen, but at the time it was the Queen, was like brought to safety, etc. And there were people who broke their arm or leg because they got stuck in the crowd controlling fences that they put up. And people were afraid. I'm not in any way trying to negate people's fear in that moment, but the response to that was a response of criminalization. So the person who screamed was, of course, called verward, which means confused in some ways. So also think about disability and the mind. Never was the moment of the scream read as a kind of protest, or maybe not even as a protest, but as an expression of grief. And instead he got a jail sentence. So I think important for me when the Never Again slogan comes up, because it feels like a slogan in some sense, or like growing up in this context. It points to the way in which that which is non-normative, which we might hope that queerness can be, as you mentioned, is criminalized. And so the ways in which I'm actually quite invested, which comes into the end of the book, which now sounds like it's a really big book, but it's okay. In how,
You've read the book, right?
yeah, how commemoration supports certain structures of criminalization, because how it upholds a certain normative who belongs and who does not belong, and the criminalization aspect is quite important.
Ask one more to say, Dan, because you did say, you were like, I think Simon asked you also, like, well, tell me about your feelings about this. And then you gave us like the most like beautiful, succinct like history, right? Which weren't really your feelings. Not to call you out on your feelings in the lifestyle. But I think something that is really important here is like, what does it mean to also feel moved by like these commemorative rituals? And like, when are we being manipulated? When are we not? When is it not to have time for critique? I think that's super valid. And I think that's a really interesting point of conversation that we're going to talk about at Cubby Bowl. Obviously, really light topics after this.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Meg, for this conversation and for the ongoing conversation and for the past conversation. And also, I just do the thank yous now because I don't want to talk again after Waqia's piece. I also want to thank Greg and the Bureau. It's been wonderful to be back here. And yeah, I think I would love to invite Waqia Abdul-Kareem to share their piece. Their work is, I don't really want to paraphrase their work, but I know them as a friend and as a performance artist. And I feel quite humbled that you want to share your work here.
Yeah, I think talk about it. So the title of this video is Black Oceanic Transformation, and the piece was originally my thesis for my MFA. I did an MFA in Performance Studies. I don't really
do performance that much anymore, but my practice back then, and I'm kind of getting back into it, kind of includes both body work, which I'm not doing here, but DJing, and then also video. So with this video, I'm kind of thinking about like, I'm taking, so Christina Sharp, who's a Black scholar, talks about in her book, In the Wake, she talks about the residence time of the wake, which is the amount of time it would take for a body to enter and exit the ocean. And I kind of took that idea and ran with it, and thinking about kind of commemoration, but kind of doing it differently, and thinking about sort of how to dwell in like an event that is very obviously traumatic and violent, but really kind of thinking of the ocean as, in one sense, we can think about it as the ruins, but also for me, I'm thinking about it as the dwelling place of my ancestors. And so this video is kind of like thinking together with them or being together with them. And the video is also like, everyone's sitting here, but ideally it would be like people are dancing, because it's going to be like it's going to be heavy stuff on the that I'm showing, but the music is kind of up tempo. And just to talk a little bit about the video itself, I'm kind of just like stealing footage. So I'm like kind of playing around with the like sort of ocean exploration video, but then kind of just like grabbing and taking archival footage, film, media, and sort of splicing them together to sort of create this story of like Black becoming underwater. Yeah, so I'll tell you. Yeah.
See that band on Christian white. God's going to trouble each water. You look like a band of the Israelite. God's going to trouble each water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's going to trouble each water. See that band all dressed in red. God is going to trouble each water. To look like a band that Moses led. God is going to trouble worked all day, worked all night, worked till his hand was sore. Worked all day, worked all night, till he couldn't wash it no more. Hey, land went down to the river, land went down to the river, Lord. Land went down to the river, and our land one pray. Land went down to the river,
That's it. I should say more than.
This is amazing.
It's really hard not to dance.
Yeah, it's like ideally.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
Staying with us.
Buy the book, they're on sale in the back.